following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
I do think at some point you can imagine the graph being something that indexes content from all kinds of data sources, whether they're blockchains or not.
GRTiQ podcast.
We are like astronauts floating in the space of time.
Welcome to the GRTiQ podcast. Today I'm speaking with Julien Genestoux, founder and CEO at Unlock Protocol, a blockchain-based access control protocol that empowers creators to monetize their content directly and enables users to manage subscriptions and earn rewards for sharing valuable content and applications. And as you likely already know, Julien was recently announced as a new member of the Graph Council. During this interview, Julien shares his remarkable entrepreneurial background. We first talk about his time at university, where Julien launched his first successful business. Then we talk about his incredible journey with his next business venture, Superfeeder, which he eventually sold to Medium. Then we discuss Julien's newest venture, Unlock Protocol, along with a great conversation about how Unlock uses the graph, how Julien became a council member, and his vision for the future of the graph. As always, we start the discussion talking about Julien's educational background.
I went to school, was not a great kid. I'm sure a great kid, but I was a great student in most of my studies. But I got better as I grew older and maybe as my field of study became narrower and narrower, and I became more interested in how actionable the things that I was learning were. I did get a software engineering degree from a university in France called INSA. It's the Institut National des Sciences Appliquées in Lyon, my hometown. And I actually was lucky enough, this is only a 5-year degree, but I cheated my way by skipping the first 2 years, because I went to another university and I was good enough that they would admit me. And then the last year I actually spent in Chicago at IIT, which stands for Illinois Institute of Technology, as an exchange student. So out of the 5 years, I actually did only 2 years on campus at that school in France. But I did get a degree from there, and that's I'm very proud of this. It's actually a pretty good degree, so I'm happy about this one.
Your degree, as I look at your educational background, you have education in finance, and you also have it in computer science and software engineering.
So that one was actually computer science. But one thing that I didn't tell you was that as I was a student, I was actually a bit bored for a couple of times. I don't call it a company first, because I created a job board for students almost by accident. It was actually one summer in 2000 or 2001. I don't remember which of the years. I was just the first year at university and I was really bored. In that summer, I was looking for a summer job. And again, if you go back 23 years now, I was like, the internet is magic. There's everything on the internet. And it's like, okay, I must find a summer job on the internet. And there is no way I could find a summer job on the internet. I was like, you know what? If I can't find a summer job on the internet, I'm going to create the job board for this. And I'm going to learn how to use the internet that everybody's talking about. And so I started my way tinkering at first with Slash, which was very early on, with MySQL, with PHP, and I created that job board. And almost it was an accident. Like I did create this, put it out there. I didn't want to register the .com domain because it felt so commercial. And I registered the .net for job étudiant, which literally means student job in French. Put that website out there, and I will say forget about this, but like put it out there and say, all right, cool, this is cool. I'm done with that project. After a few months, McDonald's, don't need to describe this, but the Happy Meal company suddenly put job offers on that website because they were hiring students from that website. And for me, that's when my head started to explode. I have the emoji exploding heads coming right to brain right now, because I realized this internet was magic for that reason. It allowed people to kind of put stuff out there for anybody else to use. And if it was useful, then great, people would use it. If I had taken a more traditional route of saying, okay, I'm going to create a business that's going to have kind of a job board online, I would have never done this. It was just too much work and too much hassle to do all of that. I'm not even sure I would have been able to do that from a legal perspective, being that I was 18, but just wasn't really a business owner. But I created that website and then run it without being a business at first for 4 or 5 years. until I actually ended up in Chicago that last year of my engineering degree. And when I was in Chicago at the time, I think it was 2004. It was 2004. Google introduced AdSense. And for people who don't know about Google AdSense, is basically ads that are shown on Google, but also can be shown on third-party sites. And my little job board was starting to be pretty popular with tens of thousands of daily visitors, and then eventually, hundreds of thousands on a monthly basis. And I put AdSense as okay, this is fun. Let's try this. Put ads. First month, I think we got almost $8,000. And this was magic. Great, a check. I got the check, put that on my bank account without any afterthoughts. My dad, who was in France at the time, called me because he had access to my French bank account and say, what is going on here? And I'm like, Dad, it's cool. It's just, it's just money that I got from Google. He's like, what? You can't really have money from Google. That's not how it works. You need to create a business. And he says, whenever you're back from Chicago, you're going to go to business school. You need to learn about how to do actually, that a business is not just a website. You need to think about, accounting. You need about finances. You need to think about hiring. You need to think about strategies, marketing, all of that. And so that wasn't necessarily the most exciting part. As being a software engineer, okay, sure. But okay, I'll do this. And I went to ESSEC, which is another university in France, to get that 1 year degree in finance and business strategy, which is really kind of, learning everything about business, and that is not the actual business itself. I won't call that an MBA, but think of it as a lighter version of an MBA. And after this, realized the business side of things was not the most interesting things, but was a requirement if I wanted to have any of my idea eventually succeed. So that, was a kind of a useful check mark that I put on my resume, while knowing very well that it wasn't going to be the last thing that I'm going to do. That said, and I kind of advancing your question, at the time, I'd spent a year in Chicago, was back in Paris. I wanted to come back to the US. And I know there's no way I could get a visa for no reason, basically. So the only way to get a visa was to apply for not quite an internship, but a first job at what was usually hiring a ton of people outside of school, which is banks. So I applied for BNP Paribas after she worked for doing an internship in France for Société Générale, which is another French bank, to get a job in San Francisco. And so my whole goal was to get as close as possible from the Valley so that I could get closer to the entrepreneurial startup-ish ecosystem, get a job, get a visa, fly, and then when I was there, figure out what the next step was. And so that's actually what I did.
Your first exposure to entrepreneurship was this job board, and the way you talk about it, it sounds like you were almost an accidental entrepreneur, but was it always your intention to be an entrepreneur? Completely
Accidental. Never my intention to be an entrepreneur. But at the same time, I'm somebody who loves to play, loves to, and I wouldn't say play, love, board games. I play with the kids. I play Catan a lot, for example. So I love this idea of okay, making my plans in my head. I'm kind of trying to look at my resources, allocating there, thinking about kind of strategies, and kind of playing the game to win. And so I realized, and I know this is not always that for everyone, and it's not always that for me either, but entrepreneurship is a lot like that. It's a lot thinking about, solving a problem, thinking about the strategies, the tactics that you're going to put in place, think about what kind of resources you have, maybe going to raise resources to actually win that game, or at least advance your ideas on the board, which I guess in the real world is, life.
During your studies in software engineering and computer science, did you ever come across some of the concepts that you would later find yourself working in with Web3, or was it too early on?
Oh, it was way too early. I mean, it was, 2000. Basically, I went to university between 2000 and 2002, then to INSA, which is that engineering school, 2003, 4, 5. So there was no blockchain. It was obviously pre-Bitcoin. It was kind of the throw of disillusionment for the internet itself. It was around the time that the dot-com bubble crashed. Most of the people in my class were about 120, ended up working for a big, Capgemini or the US Accenture, big consulting company on the change management and all of that. And that was the dream for them. And for me, it's nothing was less exciting than this kind of large, I'm going to be a project manager for this big thing, installing, some kind of system, database system, Oracle or SAP into that kind of SMB. That wasn't my excitement. I think I'm probably the only one who took kind of the entrepreneurship career, and one of the very, very few one that actually worked on the web. A few other of my colleagues I know now are in web-like industries or ended up working on mobile and things like this. But at the time, this was definitely not the sexy path or the one that people wanted to take.
An entrepreneur can obviously go into a wide range of industries, right? But you honed in fairly early on technology. How would you explain what it was about doing technology that interests you versus other things?
So I'd say it's not even technology, it's software. For me, technology, it can be rockets, it can be a lot of different things. I care very much about software as this thing that allows you to do anything without actually having to worry too much about the physical consequences of that thing. Like when you build rockets, you have to follow a very strict path and you're kind of limited by the physics of it. When you do software, you can hack a lot of things without having worried too much about the physical impact of these things. And so really that was the part that was exciting to me, kind of this very flexible matter in some way that you can play with to create interesting things. And so that job board for student was really kind of, okay, let's see what it takes to do that. And it wasn't, and I realized like, okay, it's not that much, I won't say it's not that much work, but I can do that. It's not crazy. But if I had to take the idea of building something tangible, physical, even if it was highly technological, was very scary to me. And it's still very scary to me. Like I would have no idea how to even, fix a lawnmower, which would be technology, I guess, in that work. But I do think that I'm much more at ease with the idea of software.
If one of the reasons you were interested in entrepreneurship is you were able to gamify it and put your brain, which enjoys play and gamification, to work, what would you say are the important qualities that makes an entrepreneur successful?
Yeah, it's a good one. Honestly, I can only talk about my own experience. I think for me, it's the stubbornness that is maybe one of the most critical aspects of entrepreneurship. And it's kind of contrary to what you hear or what I've seen many times where you say, oh, you need to pivot or you need to be very flexible. But at the same time, if you have a vision, that vision is going to take a lot of work to actually be shared with other people and then kind of pushed through through challenges over and over again. It's the stubbornness, it's the resilience, it's the determination. I think that actually matters much because this is a tough job. Like in practice, it's very tough also from a perspective where you have this vision and you see how things should be, how things could be. And then you have the real world and you have the thing that you're doing on a daily basis, which is usually very different from that vision. And you're trying, just with your will sometimes to get from that world that is what it is today to something that looks more like your vision. And I think this is a very frustrating kind of exercise where you always kind of have to reconcile this vision that you have, that you're selling to people and the day to day and the challenges that you have to face every day, the bugs that you didn't expect, or the people that are complaining about something that you didn't expect would work, or the competing, or the employees that are leaving or joining, and it's kind of for me, the number one criteria for a successful entrepreneur that, the 0 to 1 energy that takes something that doesn't exist to something that exists is that kind of determination, that will, that stubbornness that I don't think I see in other manager roles. Like I do think that somebody that, scales a business that exists to something else doesn't have to be necessarily as stubborn. Maybe they need to actually be a lot more flexible to be able to actually do the thing that they want to do. But the entrepreneur has to be relentlessly focused, but kind of stubborn in what they want to do. And if they fail, I think it's okay because in practice, I'd much rather fail at trying to do what I want to do rather than succeed at doing something that I don't care about.
Longtime listeners of the podcast know that I always like to ask this question to guests like you who are entrepreneurs and have had some success, which is a lot of people have interests or have ideas of things they want to do in their life, but maybe they're crippled by fear of failure. And I'm curious when I meet an entrepreneur to ask them how you think about failure. Are you afraid of failing?
I think I am, yes. And that's part of that stubbornness, right? Like if failing wasn't the problem, but it's not, again, failing is maybe not the same description as a lot of people think about. For me, failing is not doing the thing that I want to do. Failing is actually not being able to do what I want to do. It's if my vision is to paint the house in pink and I ended up painting it in blue, that's failing, even though it needed paint. I want to build the house pink and I'm going to fight really hard to actually make it pink. If it's blue, and you might say, okay, fine, you painted the house. That was the goal. It's like, no, the goal for me was to paint it pink. I don't know if there's a great analogy here, but failing is basically not doing what I want to do. And actually, it's funny because I'm lucky enough to have sold one of my companies, which was success and is success in my mind as well. But in the end, I did feel, I don't say miserable, but I didn't feel that happy once I sold the company because I was now working for somebody else and I was not able to choose the color of the house anymore. And so it's deeply in my mind, I think the success of an entrepreneur is not about whether you achieve your goal or not, is whether you actually worked on that goal. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. And I want to talk about the company that you sold. It's obviously an important part of your story. So going back and tying this all together, you move to San Francisco, you go to work in the banking industry with the intent to be super close to Silicon Valley and the entrepreneurship. What happens next professionally?
Yeah. So basically, very quickly, I start, thinking about a lot of ideas of stuff that I could work on outside of my 9 to 5, which was really kind of more of a 10 to 4 at the French bank there. It wasn't just me, like literally no one was working at the bank, which is kind of always surprising to me. But anyway, that was the early days of Web 2. One thing that I would say, like a lot of people here that are listening to this are probably very well aware of Web 3 and kind of criticize Web 2 for what it is now. But the ideals of Web 2 way back in 2008, 9 were actually very similar to the kind of ideals that we have in Web 3. It just got perverted by, how the web eventually worked out. But I do think that some of the ideals around then, around, user-generated content, giving a voice to everyone, that were actually very similar to some of the ideals that we had now. But anyway, I was myself using a feed reader. And I don't know if everybody is familiar with feed readers, but RSS feeds. So I was using kind of this tool that allows you to subscribe to multiple news sources and get the information in a single place. This was kind of pre-Twitter or early Twitter. This was pre-Facebook or early Facebook. Really kind of the beginning of that. And the names that might come to mind to people are stuff like Flickr, like Delicious, like I was going to even mention WordPress, but I'd say it's even pre-WordPress, like Typepad, which was one of the early blogging platforms, or Movable Type, which was actually the first blogging platform out there. And it was the idea, okay, that feed reader allowed me to read content from many different places in one go. I wanted to build something that would be kind of like a feed reader, but in a push way rather than a pull way. So the feed reader, you have to connect to a web page and you have to refresh and it just loads a lot of information. I want to build a system where basically I would get notified whenever any of the sources of content that I subscribe to would publish something. And so I built first a service that I called Notifictious that was basically a notification service when, my favorite blogs or website would update, when the weather in San Francisco would change, because I was using RSS feed from a weather app and things like this. I built this, didn't get a lot of success around this, but we had an API that started to be used by multiple companies to a point where it's like I emailed these companies and say, hey, would you pay us to actually use that API more? And they said, yes, happily. So if you build this, and that, we pay for the API. And so that's how I ended up building a new service, kind of, I don't want to say forking away because it's kind of the same. It was the API powering Notifictious, but a new infrastructure called Superfeedr, which still exists today, has been sold to Medium, but still exists, an RSS feed API system. So it's basically an API that allows people to subscribe to changes in RSS feeds and be notified in real time when these feeds update. So you're listening to this as a podcast. All of the podcasting infrastructure is all powered by RSS, really simple syndication. If you're using, some app on your phone, it's likely pulling the data from the GRTiQ website through an RSS feed. But again, many websites were using this. And Superfeedr quickly became it's not the most used RSS feed API out there. We were basically pulled constantly by services like Google or Facebook and syndicating content from, all of the big newspapers, e-commerce sites, social networks, all together. And so we built kind of an API that was doing both ways. On one side, pulling the data and then pushing it to people on the other side.
What was that experience like for you? I mean, it's kind of like lightning has struck twice in your life and maybe 3 or 4 more times where a lot of entrepreneurs fail, but you had the job board success, but now you're working on Superfeedr and this is also a success.
So it wasn't always a success. It was honestly a lot of work. There was a bunch of years where it was like, damn it, nobody cares about RSS. And the fact is, fewer and fewer people cared about this open web between 2010 and let's say 2015. There was definitely an era of everybody was building mobile apps for iOS and Android. People cared about the Facebook platform and not so much about the open web anymore. And so for me, that was actually a struggling time. Roughly at the same time, I started to also get involved with W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium. And I worked on a specification called WebSub. It was basically an evolution of the API that Superfeedr has built into a protocol so other applications could easily do that, that kind of pulling and pushing. So it wasn't always a success. I mean, it wasn't always a success. Eventually, our biggest customer, Media, reached out to me and say, hey, we're going to build all of these new things. And we think Superfeedr might be a great fit for us. inside of Medium, do you want to sell Medium to us? And that's how actually I ended up doing this. There's a bunch of personal story behind this as well. Even though I was in San Francisco when I created Superfeeder, I had to go back to Europe in 2010. My wife didn't have a visa anymore, so we had to move back to Europe. So it was a whole like, okay, fine, we're going to move back to the US after this. I had 2 kids in the meantime. So lots of personal challenges, but it wasn't always a success. But what I kept at it is like, no, this vision of syndicating content is the right one. I want to keep pushing for that one because I do think it's a better version of the open web than just everybody's using Twitter to push their content. So eventually sold Superfeeder to Medium, worked for Medium for about 2 years on lots of different things.
The GRTiQ podcast is made possible by a generous grant from the Graph Foundation. The Graph Grants program provides support for protocol infrastructure, tooling, dApps, subgraphs, and community building efforts. Learn more at thegraph.foundation. That's thegraph.foundation.
Hi, this is GRTiQ, and thank you for listening. Listeners who enjoy this content can help support the GRTiQ podcast by leaving a review or a 5-star rating wherever they download podcasts, by sharing episodes on social media, or by simply telling a friend or colleague about something they heard or learned from one of our guests. It's support from listeners like you that make it possible for us to keep shining a light on the people and stories behind Web3 and the graph. How does an entrepreneur know when to quit? I know that stubbornness and resilience is something that you've clicked on a couple times there, but it's rational to think there is a point at which you should quit, or no?
I'm sure there is. I don't think I've ever made that decision. So the Medium example, this was obvious to me, like, there was a big check. And I had 2 kids and a wife. At some point you realize, they're going to keep Superfeeder alive. And as a matter of fact, it is still alive. I can maybe have more impact at Medium building some of the similar things. And I actually did work on similar things at Medium after I joined them. So I don't know if it's quitting, and maybe you can say, yeah, it's quitting. I think life decides for you when it's time to quit. I know some people are founding startup and they run out of money, and it's I'd say it's okay if you give it your best shot. It's not failing, basically. It's being not able to work on this. And if you give it your best shot, if you didn't get distracted by building some things that were not interesting, that were not your initial vision, I think it's okay. But again, I think there's many types of entrepreneurs. I know people that are very good at jumping onto the new hotness, actually very successful at this. And they've done like 5 companies in 5 different fields. That is not how I work, because I'm, again, somebody who cares about what I do more than the outcome. But I don't think everyone works the same.
So if you learned at the job board company that you started at the prodding of your father to go back and learn finance and some of the quote unquote business basics, what are the key lessons you learned out of your experience launching Superfeeder?
Yeah. First, one of the big experiences is like thinking more about the landscape. Superfeeder, RSS feed, open web was built at a time where very few people actually cared about the open web anymore. And fewer people. And so I think it's more of the timing aspect of things. I realize you're going to make your life much harder if you start something when the market is not there or when the market is leaving. And so that's definitely one of the lessons that I taken from this. I actually wrote a blog post about, you can be right at the wrong time. It's going to be tough. And that was kind of the story here, is like, it's a matter of getting there. And as a matter of fact, RSS today is getting actually more steam behind it than it was for a long time. There's a lot of people that are thinking more about, okay, syndicating content between different publishers, different creators. When it was that it lost a bit of steam, we regularly see on Twitter people complaining about the fact that Google shut down Google Reader, which was the biggest feed reader. And I think it would be a better time to do it, to launch a feed reader now than it has been in 2012 or 13, for example, when I was spending my energy doing that. So I think there's the timing aspect is maybe one of the big things. They say a rising tide lifts all boats. I think it's much easier to build a business when the tide is rising, basically, than it is when the tide is low. So that's maybe one of the big lessons. Another lesson which I take in there. So we raise money, but I'm always very frugal. I was of the mindset that we need to be profitable as soon as possible, and we ended up being profitable less than a year after raising funds. I do think that we could have grown more if I'd actually invested more of that money into growing rather than into becoming sustainable. And that's something that I learned later. Silicon Valley at the time, and I think it's still the case, doesn't actually give you that big of a premium for being sustainable, profitable. It gives you a premium for growing fast. And so that's something that I learned as well. It's not the normal way of doing business. I'd say most businesses in the world, they need to be profitable more than growing. But the VC world, the Silicon Valley world, actually doesn't care if you're profitable. There's even a saying that, you'd rather have stories that have numbers. So it's kind of like even if your numbers look good, they don't look as good as the story that you can make up if you don't have numbers. And so I think there is definitely something here to be learned as a founder is be really good at telling stories, and you might not ever need to actually show numbers to anyone.
It's great advice. And again, longtime listeners of the podcast will remember that was advice from Ryan Selkis, the founder over at Masari, that the first lesson he learned as an entrepreneur is to be a masterful storyteller.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's critical. But storytelling is not just pitching, right? It's basically showing the whole journey and explaining why you do things, how you do things, and kind of being your whole self, like not trying to be someone else. I think a lot of people assume storytelling is basically telling a nice story. It doesn't have to be a nice story. It has to be a true story. I think is a much better, more impactful thing than a nice story or a sincere story, I'd say, more than even true itself.
I've had a lot of entrepreneurs on the podcast. Some are early stage, some are further along, but I haven't had many that have sold one of their entrepreneurial ventures. And you're one of the few that have. Talk to us about that experience. You've referenced it a couple times, but you eventually sold to Medium. Everybody listening to podcasts knows who and what Medium is. What was that experience like?
Honestly, it was really smooth. So Medium, despite being a company that a lot of people knew, I hadn't done any acquisition before Superfeedr. So we had a lot of conversation with the tech leadership, with Ev Williams, the founder. Honestly, I had a great time. They worked with really good people. And so the whole process was a lot easier than what I thought. We very quickly already agreed on kind of the base numbers. And from there, they really gave me opportunities. Say, hey, okay, cool. We're, hiring you, acquiring the company, and then you're going to work for us. Please tell us what you want us to do or what you would work on. And so that was really powerful to me. So really great experience. Medium, I think, was also at a very interesting step in their journey. They were trying to monetize with ads because that was the number one thing that everybody was doing. It's like, oh, we'll just monetize with ads. And so we did a couple trials. We put ads on the website in some, specific places. And the result that we're getting, the CPM, basically, which is the revenue per 1,000 pages, was so low that there was no way we could actually monetize Medium completely with ads without completely degrading the experience. And Ev, being stubborn, which I think is a good thing, really wanted to build that kind of very simple, clear reading experience away from this Christmas tree-like experiences that you might find on some other websites. And so we had this interesting realization, like, okay, if we want Medium to be financially viable at some point, we will need to change the business model. We cannot do ads. We need to think more about what we're going to do and how we're going to do things. We looked at a bunch of other models. We looked at New York Times. The New York Times was closing on 1 million subscribers. We looked at Patreon. We looked at subtitling system. But we looked at a lot of other places, Spotify, Netflix, and realized, like, okay, this preconception of the early web that everything needs to be free was not true anymore. There's actually a way to make money by having some kind of model where your customers, your users rather, become customers. And so that's when Medium embarked on the journey of launching a membership program. And to me, that was kind of a very interesting moment to be at Medium, because this was kind of like, okay, we're kind of moving away from this attention-driven model, which is not going to work for many reasons, including the fact that it was economically not viable, toward that membership-driven model. And Medium did this first couple of days. Actually, first day we launched this, we almost had 10,000 subscribers. So 10,000 people paying $5 a month. So that's day one, $50,000 in the bank, that would come. And for me, that was kind of a ha-ha moment. It's like, okay, people are fine paying for stuff. What's even more surprising is, like, even though there was a paywall, very few of these people that were paying on the first day actually had read any of the article that were paywall. So we messaged them and say, hey, why are you paying? I mean, please keep doing it. Don't get us wrong. But like, why are you paying? And the answer was consistently the same. I pay because I support the vision, the mission that Medium has. I pay because I care about that application. I spend my days on this and I think it's good. I pay because I want the green halo around my avatar. And for me, that's the beginning of that thinking that, okay, wait, from the beginning, we thought of attention as the only way to make money on the web, but actually membership is a much more powerful mechanism. And I realized, like, even though I do pay for a bunch of people on Patreon, I actually don't listen to their music. I don't care about the music or the content they produce, but I want to support them because I care about them and it's cheap. I'm a subscriber to New York Times. I probably don't read more than, a couple articles a month, maybe more than a couple articles a month, but 4 or 5 articles a week. I do play a bit with the games, especially since they acquired Wordle, but I care more about being able to access when I want to. I care more about the status than I care about the actual story or a specific story that I could read from there. And so I realized that membership model is something that could exist on the web at scale. If you go back 2000s, the bulletin board systems, there's kind of forums that you would go to and there was people that had kind of an OG status. If at the time there was an easy way to pay to get the status, I'm sure all of these communities would have monetized that way. It would have been a much easier, much better model than the one to put up banner ads everywhere that would end up being blocked by ad blockers anyway.
There's a lot to unpack there, and that's a super interesting story. But I want to ask you this question about the dichotomy between Web 2 and Web 3. As somebody who is successful in Web 2, went to work at a leading Web 2 company, Medium is very well known, very well established. How do you think through the ways in which Web 2 incumbent firms will deal with this rising interest in industry of Web 3?
Yeah, it's definitely a good question, and one that I wonder, I'm not on a daily basis, but a lot about. So first of all, I think I know why in the Web3 space we tend to kind of antagonize Web 2, but I think it's wrong. I think it's not about Web 2 versus Web 3 or any of that. It's going to be, how can we make Web 2 people more successful by embracing Web 3? That's the only way Web 3 can succeed. And if you think about other eras like this, right? Like the internet, early days of the internet were not built against Microsoft or Windows. It really became powerful when Windows actually started to have Internet Explorer as the default navigator, and it became kind of a true piece out there on the ecosystem. Kind of an anecdote, but like Apple almost died, but was saved because they realized that we need to have Microsoft Office and Excel, and Word and Excel on the Mac in 298 or something like this. And so they basically hired a team to just work on a version of Word, and Excel would be compatible with the Windows version of this. So it's really kind of, if we want to Web3 to succeed, we're going to have to find ways to make Web2, again, platforms more successful because they do things with Web3 technologies. So because they allow people to connect their wallets, because they allow people to have NFTs or show PFPs on their profile. And because in the end, Web3 provide them opportunities that they wouldn't have if they're stuck to their existing models. So for me, that's one of the things that I think a lot about every day. And we can talk about how Unlock does this specifically. But for me, that's the critical part. It's like, we shouldn't go after, it's like, hey, we're doing a better thing. They're not going to merge. We're doing something that lets you, Instagram, Amazon, Apple, LinkedIn, Google, be more successful or solve a problem that you have, because they do have problems. However big they have, however big they are, they have problems. They have things that they're trying to solve. And I do think Web3 provides a bunch of solutions to some of these problems.
So it's a question I ask guests all the time. Are you then envisioning Web 2 and Web 3 sort of coexisting or melding together in the future? And you don't accept this idea that it's an either or battle?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think they're going to be, I don't say merged, but I don't think at some point you'll be able to distinguish. In the same way that, when you think about the web, the mobile devices, can you distinguish them from like the web? Is there a mobile web that is not the web? No, it's the mobile web is the web. It's like the thing that you use there. Or can you think of the web as something that is not on computers? Of course it is on computers. Like that's, and so I do think that we'll have to have Web3 be a component of our tech stacks, and the tools that we use today will need to embrace that no matter what. That doesn't mean that there's not going to be new players. That's not going to be new applications, new successful products and companies that are massively popular that didn't exist before. But I do think that the only way to success for us in the Web3 space is to convince Web 2 with a lot of air quotes, crowds that Web3 is an opportunity for them, not something that goes after them.
So how do you make sense of the emergence of Web3 then? I mean, sometimes it's framed as a revolution against Web 2. Other times it's framed as a natural evolutionary phase or step of progress. How do you make sense of it?
I think it's both. In some way, it's a revolutionary, again, not quite against Web 2, but like moving away from some of the limits of Web 2. So kind of data ownership, control of information and that. But it's also, for me, a logical step in how we build that collective brain of ours, which is the internet. Let's take maybe a little aside here, but I think we barely realize how impactful the internet is on our lives. But if you shut down your connection for even a day, it is actually really, really hard to do a lot of things that you take for granted. Like we're recording this podcast. There is no way we would be able to do that if it wasn't for the internet. After 2 years of pandemic, most of us didn't lose their jobs because of the pandemic. If it wasn't for the internet, there wouldn't be, most of the jobs would have been lost for sure. We order food, we interact with our, I live far from my family, obviously my parents and, my friends, some of my friends are in France. If it wasn't for the internet, it would be really, really hard to keep in touch with them. And yet I'm able to keep in touch with them almost as if I lived a couple miles from them at this point. This is all because of that collective brain that is the internet. So I do think this tech stack is evolving. It's constantly getting better. We're doing this in video. I remember the early days of the internet where you had to download real networks to kind of have a video. There was no way this would have worked in the web browser, and yet it is working. So I think the web is slowly but surely, the internet is slowly but surely evolving, having more and more capabilities. And these capabilities are what allows us to build better apps. I think, for better or worse, Bitcoin introduced a new kind of capability into or actually maybe multiple kinds of capability into the internet tech stack. First of all, the moneyness. So basically introduce programmable money, which I think is a good way to describe Bitcoin. But also I think introduce the concept of DAO or shared infrastructure that we all collectively use that nobody controls. So nobody controls Bitcoin, and yet we can all use that. And I think now that model has been taken over obviously by Ethereum, by the graph and multiple other tech stacks. I'm thinking, for example, stuff like IPFS is doing, or Protocol Labs is doing on that front, where nobody controls any of that. But then we still have the emergent network that is a collectively owned or collectively controlled shared infrastructure.
So going back to your personal story, you sold to Medium, you stayed on board for a couple of years to help with the transition and support Medium. What did you do after that?
Yeah. So when I was at Medium, actually, we did that membership thing. And I was like, this is really interesting, but I want to build something that is actually web scale, not just Medium scale. And I had the idea, and it was kind of the beginning. It's like, can we decentralize the Medium paywall? Can we make it so that on my own site, which I have had for like 20 years, can I paywall content so that only people that are paying for Medium actually see my content? And can Medium as a business go to publishers and say, hey, New York Times, maybe not New York Times because they're pretty successful paywall, but like, small indie publishers, The Atlantic, for example, what if we gave you money to paywall your content so that the Medium membership would become kind of a paywall for the web? So people pay for that membership and then they access content on the medium.com website, but also on The Atlantic or, USA Today or other websites. And so thinking a lot about that, okay, how can we decentralize that membership model? At the time, looking for different options, none were crypto, but like that was kind of one of the ideas that I started to work on. I also worked on one of the fun ideas that Medium had, which I think they still do, which is to pay creators. So if you're a writer and you write on Medium and you token gate the content, you put it behind the paywall, you're going to get a share of what people end up paying on a monthly basis. This was good, but this was actually really hard to put in place. In the US, we use Stripe chargebacks to actually pay people on their cards when they were making money from the works that they were writing on Medium. But that only worked in the US. If we wanted to pay a writer in Hungary or in Mexico or in India or in France, it was really hard. And so I was like, what are the solutions for this? And that's how I, like, wait, maybe Bitcoin or blockchain were the things. Like maybe we can actually send money. 2015, 16, right? Actually 17. Maybe we can send money to these people rather than actually do wire transfers, which would be a nightmare, wouldn't scale, send them money using cryptocurrencies. And that's how I kind of rediscovered Bitcoin and rediscovered that crypto offered interesting things. It's like, okay, if we pay people using cryptocurrencies, maybe we can be a bit smarter and not just pay them to do that, but kind of incentivize them, or not just give them money, but give them some kind of reward in tokens for work that they could do on the platform. One of the, I wouldn't say issues, but one of the topics that Medium had at the time was a lot about curation. How can we find the best stories on the platform? And we used AI a bit. We used other kind of machine learning techniques like, okay, if you like this, you like that kind of scenario. But we also realized, there's actually people that are really good at surfacing articles. There's an expert in botanistry that can find the best articles about botanistry. Is there a way we can reward that person with some kind of token? So I explored crypto 2017, early 18, a lot with the idea of trying to find models that we could build inside of Medium that would reward users for the work that we would do here. I did design, I remember, I think 3 or 5 of these models, maybe even built, I actually even built an experiment and then tried to pitch Ev and the rest of the leadership team at Medium. It was like, let's do this. Every time they were pushing back, at some point I said, you know what? I'm too excited about these ideas. Rather than actually be disappointed by the fact that I cannot work on what I want to work on, I'm going to leave and start to work on this by myself. And that's how we ended up creating Unlock.
So was the first time that you really got interested or serious about crypto during this period, or had you heard about it before and just didn't think much of it?
So I heard about it and actually played with it a little bit, which is luck more than anything. One of the contractors that I was working with at the time was Superfeedr in 2011 asked to be paid in Bitcoin. And I was like, okay, what's Bitcoin? And I remember at the time I messaged my CPA and tell, hey, this contractor doesn't want to be paid in dollar. He's actually in Europe and doesn't believe in the dollar. It's, and it was anti-US, but like a strong critic of the US policy around the world and doesn't want to be paid in dollar. How do I do that? And the CPA was like, I don't care how you do this. You're not going to do this. You're just going to pay yourself in dollars. And then with the dollars that you get on your bank account, Julien, go buy Bitcoin, whatever that is, and then send that to your guy. That's going to be easy. So I had to actually do the work. I downloaded Bitcoin QT or a few other wallets, started to even mine a little bit. I don't think I earned anything on that front, but I actually did buy some Bitcoin from Mongox, which was the very first exchange that a lot of people ended up buying Bitcoin from way back, June 2011. So played a little bit with this. Realized that this is actually very interesting, but didn't really understood the path to making it something that was user-friendly. So like, okay, this is really powerful, but it's way too complicated for normies to get. And honestly, that's a problem that I keep making, a mistake that I keep making. So again, played with this, found it interesting, didn't really, explore much further, go back to my day-to-day. A bit later, I think it was 2015, my good friend Jan was in Switzerland at the time, tells me about Ethereum and say, hey, look, this blockchain stuff, Bitcoin is interesting, but Ethereum was not mainnet yet. So it was pre-Homestay, I think it was called. And told me like, there's this thing, it allows you to create smart contracts, which are kind of interesting. And then I downloaded Mist, which was one of the very first wallets. It was actually a web browser with a wallet. And I played with this. And I was like, okay, I see something there, but still, way too complicated, way too messy, not going to do something. So when I was at Medium, it was kind of really the third time that I, okay, I'm going to explore this. So it took me a little while. Like I was a bit naive, I guess, or it took me a little while to actually get to a point like, okay, now I see this. Now I think we have something that is usable-ish to start thinking more about these technologies.
What did you notice in the evolution of the UX from interacting early in 2011 with that contractor living in Europe to 2017 and applying it to what you were doing at Unlock? Did things improve drastically?
Yeah, I think one of the big things for me was the fact that, okay, now this lives in the browser. So Bitcoin QT, was a standalone app. There was no really easy way to actually make that work on the web app. Mist, web browser-ish, but still, okay, people are just using Firefox and Chrome. Why would I, ask them to use these kind of different things? When it started to be in the browser and that MetaMask extension was kind of the thing, now I realize, okay, these two worlds are, I don't think merging, but they're collided. Now it becomes possible for people to use crypto, it was called Web3 at the time, in a way that doesn't really require them to kind of start from scratch with a new stack. And for me, that was kind of the starting point. And maybe the difference between Mist and Bitcoin's wallets at the time, Bitcoin wallets were Bitcoin nodes. you actually had to sync with the network, which is going to be insane. We think about this because it would taking days, and there's no way this would get to a point where it's like usable. Mist, even though it had a node, if I remember correctly, was already connecting to RPC providers. So there was kind of already progress there in terms of UX. And I think we're getting there to a point. Okay, now we have wallets integrated in browsers natively. I'm using Brave and it has its own wallet in it, which is great. But I think we're moving even further than this with stuff like a kind of abstraction in that actually allow apps to have wallets without users knowing or caring too much about that.
Hi, this is Julien Genestoux with Unlock Protocol. If my conversation with the GRTiQ podcast has been helpful to you, then please consider supporting future episodes by becoming a subscriber. Visit grtiq.com/podcast for more information. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
GRTiQ.
Podcast.
Thanks for listening.
So you're working at Medium, you get the idea for decentralizing the membership model, and then you go out and you found a third entrepreneurial venture called Unlock. How has Unlock evolved? What types of problems are you working on now?
Yeah, so Unlock is a protocol for memberships. It's basically a way for all kinds of creators, developers to deploy membership contract and then not only on one side sell these memberships in the form of NFTs that expire every month, they can have recurring revenue, but also provide benefits to people based on whether they have a membership or not. So basically token gating is the number one benefit that people can think of. You cannot access unless you have the NFT in your wallet. We launched very early on, actually. I mean, the first version hit in January 2019. If you're mainnet, there was the only network at the time that had, any kind of EVM, smart contract infrastructure in place. And we launched it and that was kind of the first of our attempts. It was actually version 0 of the protocol. It's still out there. It's still usable, I guess. Very limited, very expensive on if you're mainnet. And since then, we haven't stopped iterating on that idea to make it easier, simpler, more flexible, and support more features to cover more use cases. So one of the first things that we've done, for example, initially, the memberships themselves could only be priced in the native currency, so in Ether of the chain. But quickly, we had a bunch of users that told, hey, this is great, but honestly, ETH goes up and down and up and down. It reached, $1,200 and it went back to like $80. As a creator, I cannot have my income be up and down every month based on currency itself. We'd love to be able to use stable coins. That's when DAI started to emerge as an option. And so we started to basically add support for ERC20 as the currency that people could price their memberships in. So that was one of the first things we've done. After this, we've added the capability to support fiat payment because we had a bunch of people say, hey, this is great, but half of my fans, or maybe even 2/3 or 4/4 of my fans don't have crypto wallets, and asking them to first download a crypto wallet, then go to Coinbase, then transfer tokens from Coinbase to the wallet, and then pay me feels like a lot of work. Is there a way you can actually add support for fiat systems? And so we've added credit card payments early on. And then we basically kept iterating by adding more and more stuff. In 2020, we added multiple networks. So one of the things that we realized, actually 2021, one of the things that we realized is like, if your mainnet will never be cheap again. Might be marginally cheaper at some point and more expensive at others. But it's the, I describe this as the Fort Knox. It's basically the highest security environment that you can be on, which means that it's going to be very expensive. And security is good when you're, high security is good when you're transacting tens of thousands of dollars or even hundreds or millions. But when you're buying, $1 membership, it doesn't make sense to pay, the highest security thing in the world for something that is not as valuable anyway. So we start to look at stuff like other chains. And so we launched on XDAI, which now is called Gnosis Chain. And so that's when we started to kind of explore the multi-chain environment. And since then, we've now are available on 9 EVM networks. We've added a DAO, which from the beginning, we had the vision that the protocol needed to be decentralized. It couldn't be owned by me or our team. It had to be owned by our collective DAO. So we introduced a DAO. We introduced a governance token to make the DAO work. So it's been basically iterating on that idea and then pushing it further and further into the adoption curve.
For listeners that want to learn more about Unlock and get involved in the community, what's the best way to get started?
I'd say the website, unlock-protocol.com. Go there, we have a ton of links. Maybe the one thing that I would recommend people is like join our Discord. What's interesting, it's like a lot of other places you can ask questions in Discord, but we actually have our own community token. It's a free one. It's actually on Polygon, so you might not even have to pay even gas. We subsidize gas for this. You claim that membership token is valid for a month, and then you can join the Discord. And then on the Discord, you can ask all the questions in the world that you want. We really put that step because we think it's critical to have the so-called dogfooding to show people like, this is how it works, so that you can actually understand more than just asking questions. We get a lot of people like, oh, can I do this, this, and this? Like, just use the thing. You'll understand how to do things a lot more by using it than just by asking me a question. Like somebody said this, but like words are actually very low fidelity. And you might ask me all of the questions in the world and never get a good idea what something is until you actually see it, until you actually touch it, play with it, right? I mean, I can describe the Eiffel Tower as much as I want. Until you see it, maybe a picture, it's going to be really hard for you to make sense of like this, it's metal tower that goes very high with stairs. It's like, okay, that's kind of an idea of this, but when you see it, now you understand what it is. And when you visit it, now you get a sense. I can describe, eating a burger, but until you actually do this, it's going to be really hard for you to actually make a good sense of it. I think it's the same with a lot of the product that we use in crypto. I can explain to you what a wallet is. I can explain to you what, paying to access a website is. But until you actually do this, it's going to be really hard for you to have a good idea of what it actually enables and what it does.
Well, I'll put links to all of the things you mentioned there in the show notes. So I want to encourage any listeners that want to learn more about Unlock and get involved in that community to visit the show notes. There'll be plenty of links. Julien, as some of the listeners have already picked up on, part of the reason we're talking today is because you were recently announced as one of the new council members joining the Graph Council. And I wanted to get to know you and introduce your story more to the community. If we go back in time and think about the first time you became aware of the Graph, when was that? And what do you recall thinking about the protocol at that time?
It was September 2019. So I think very early on for the Graph as a project, we were already building a bunch of infrastructure that I realized pretty quickly was going to be obsolete because it was painful to build. So basically, simple thing, right? When you send transaction on chain, you have to wait for that transaction to be mined before you can actually retrieve results from there. And if you lost the hash of the transaction, then it's really hard later on to actually go back and see what the transaction did. And so we built this infrastructure to store transaction hashes and then, pull them. And then when they were mined, kind of extract information about, okay, this is the smart contract that was deployed, this is the token that was minted, all of that. And it was like one of my team member, Akeem at the time, was like, hey, look, there's this thing called the Graph that just goes out that allows us to kind of not have to worry about that infrastructure. They actually build the mechanisms to handle changes on chain and kind of build a data store from these changes that we can then query, and we don't have to worry about that. And so that's at the time, Akeem built the first subgraph to use Unlock. And then we started to play with this and realized like, okay, this is much better than our own thing. And it's also much better, not just for us, but as an infrastructure. It's much better to have a protocol to retrieve data from chains that would be standard in a way that doesn't require us to make a billion RPC calls and would be kind of always up to date, but also even compatible with the fancier way to do data stores, which is GraphQL at this point. So realize like, okay, there is something really powerful around these shared protocol, because the Graph is a protocol that allow people to build application by abstracting away some of the complexities around querying blockchain nodes.
So you developed some early conviction for the Graph and the solution it provides long before any contemplation of joining the council or getting involved in the community.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think there was a council at the time. So I realized like, okay, this is valuable infrastructure for the Web3, but for the web down the line. And I do think that eventually, I mean, I know there's a bunch of efforts around IPFS indexing the Graph. I do think at some point you can imagine the Graph being something that indexes content from all kinds of data sources, whether they're blockchains or not. I've been playing a lot with Blue Sky, the new Twitter clone. And I was like, okay, maybe there's actually some way of building subgraphs for Blue Sky that would allow me to query for specific things. And as long as you have ways to ensure that the data is correct, then building subgraphs that are queryable, that are indexed by multiple players is a good way of building this kind of infrastructure. If you think about the web, one of the most popular companies in the web is Google, and their only job has been to index the web. Only job, it's a pretty significant job, but index the web and kind of serve results fast. I do think that things like the Graph would allow us to build similar kind of search engines for data that is being published on chain, but also on other data sources, and then have this as a building blocks that any kind of website could integrate easily to, again, do the querying and the retrieval of data from multiple data sources.
Julie, you've mentioned a couple times already, and it's very apparent in your own story. You're a busy person. You've got a family. You're an entrepreneur. You're always building, and it sounds like tinkering with ideas. And you've got a lot of time constraints, and yet you accepted the opportunity to join the Graph Council. Talk us through that decision and why you decided to go to work on the Graph Council.
Yeah. So you remember what I said about dogfooding a couple of minutes ago? So the need for us to use our things more. I do think, lots of very smart people work in the crypto space, in the Web3 space specifically, but there's not enough cross-pollination. We don't actually do enough stuff together. I feel like, there is the people at Uniswap do amazing things, and then the people at Aave do amazing things. The combination of these two things maybe is more powerful. Unlock, we do amazing things. We actually use the graph. And I was like, okay, we use the graph. We have some graphs as well. If I get the opportunity to join this, I should definitely get this, because first I can improve modestly what the graph does, participate in the governance, because it's something that I use and rely on, and I want to make sure that it's available for this. But also I can modestly share a little bit of the experience that I've acquired as a user, but also as somebody who's building in the Web3 space, and maybe even bigger in the open web space. So for me, it was more like I see this as an opportunity for me more than, I'm sure it's an opportunity for the graph, but like an opportunity for me to, shape the web to be more like what I want, rather than just, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years from now, like complain about the state of things. And I see this as a builder, as somebody in that space. It's our responsibility to, be the change we want to see in the world kind of thing. And that was an opportunity to do that. And so I jumped on that.
You've gone from a user of the graph to council member involved with the community. What have you learned about the graph in this new role? I know it's relatively new, but you must have made some early observations about the graph community ecosystem and what the protocol is doing.
First, I didn't, before joining the council, I didn't know about the structure around the graph's governance. And for me, that was kind of an interesting thing, like realizing there's all of these ecosystem players, from the indexers to the core developers, and kind of see how these people work together. So for me, that was one of the first realization. Okay, this governance system is kind of an interesting one because it has multiple kinds of player. If you think about Unlock, we do have two kinds of player, but with the governance, we abstract away the complexity. Like if you are one client, if you have tokens, you can govern. If you don't have tokens, you cannot govern. I don't care why you have token or how you earn these tokens, but if you have token, you need to govern. So I like the idea of the graph as being kind of this kind of almost like the Senate in the US being representation of the states versus the House being representation of people. I like that kind of difference of different roles having different representations instead of the ecosystem. So that was one of the first things. Definitely been excited by the work. And I've been following what the team at StreamFast has been doing. Actually, I've known that team before they joined the graph as well. Met them in Waterloo. It was in November 2019. And really been excited about that. Okay, the work that they're building around streams and being able to kind of extract data faster to index it faster. So for me, that was kind of an interesting thing. Dove a bit deeper on the technical infrastructure of how things are built. Obviously excited about the move away from the hosted infrastructure to the decentralized network, which I think is really powerful. At the same time, really want to see that being something that becomes the default for all of the EVM networks. And I know it's kind of an ongoing work to kind of support, all of the networks there, despite some challenges. On the council, we just recently voted to have Polygon and Phantom be pushed to the decentralized network, and realize like, okay, there's complexities around how these blockchains are built, specifically Polygon, because it's so high velocity, I'd say, that it creates some challenges around indexing and making sure that the data that you index is up to date and never, tracks too far from the state up to chain. So yeah, this has been a very interesting journey. I think it's been a month and a half at this point, so fairly early, but really excited to be part of this. And again, learning more than I contribute still, but I do hope that my contribution will eventually be more than what I've done so far.
What makes you optimistic about Web3, the future of Web3?
I do think that it's a better way to build technology altogether. It's one way where we build technologies with its users, with its stakeholders. Again, don't want to say Web 2, but like one thing that I think is very wrong with the architecture of the web is that client-server model. I think in the end, it's actually not only a bad name, but it gives way more control to the server than what we should have. I think Web3, even though it's not always peer-to-peer in the system, is a way to rebalance this, to have a model that is a lot more balanced between the users, because in the end, these users can actually be co-owners of the infrastructure that they use. And so creating a much healthier design for how things work on the web. The current server model, goes as far as, Facebook changes the look of the wall, and then nobody has a choice. But in a world where, Facebook is collectively owned by its users, maybe users can actually influence or change how things are being done. And so for me, that's the promise of Web3, is like trying to build a tech infrastructure that serves everyone's interest, not just the interest of a single company or a small number of companies, and then maybe their shareholders altogether.
What makes you optimistic about the future of the graph?
Yes. So I do think that as more and more content is being produced, we need that content to be indexed more and more. And when I say produced, obviously on-chain, but even off-chain in that world, we need to be indexed more and more. And I do think there is a true need for that kind of data availability layer to be trusted, to be replicated, to be indexed by anyone, and anyone can contribute new models and new subgraphs to that. So there is no way we're going to go to a world where there's less data that needs to be less indexed. And so for me, that's the opportunity that the graph is going after.
So Julien, now we've reached a point in the podcast where I'm going to ask you the GRTiQ 10. These are 10 questions I ask each week to every guest that joins me. And I do it to help listeners learn something new, try something different, or achieve more in their own life. So are you ready for the GRTiQ 10?
Ready, let's do it.
The GRTiQ 10.
This is the way.
10 questions for astronauts floating in space.
What book or article has had the most impact on your life?
Article, I would definitely say something. So I read Kevin Kelly, editor of Wired. He wrote something called 1,000 True Fans, where basically the point that he was making, like that big village that we're building with the internet, would allow any kind of creator of any kind to monetize their work, because there's always 1,000 true fans around the web for their specific kind of work. So it might feel very niche, kind of music or kind of painting or kind of art. But with the scale of the web, there's always going to be someone and 1,000 someones that are going to be fans of this. So that's definitely the kind of article that actually inspired a lot of my thinking around how to monetize work on the internet.
Is there a movie or a TV show that you think everybody should watch?
I don't watch movies and I don't watch TV much. So it's hard. I mean, I think, and again, it's going to be lame and I'm going to feel old, but I enjoy The Matrix when I saw that many years ago. I do think that a lot of the web today feels like you choose the kind of, on one side, you don't have to think about what's happening and being, I don't think manipulated, but being fed without actually worrying about what is being fed to you, or trying to kind of see how the sausage is made and change the sausage factory to make healthier sausages.
And how about this one? If you could only listen to one music album for the rest of your life, which one would you choose?
It's a good question. I actually don't have a good answer for that one. I'm not a big music listener, but let's pick something like Daft Punk. I enjoy Daft Punk.
What's the best advice someone's ever given to you?
One that I think a lot about is, if you can change something, don't complain about it. Change it. It's something that I've been thinking a lot about. And I think it's a big motivator for me as an entrepreneur. It's like there's, we can't do everything. But I do think that compared to people that lived, 200 years ago, there's a lot of things that we can do. And so it's really up to us to oftentimes do these things rather than just complain about these things.
What's one thing you've learned in your life that you don't think most other people have learned or know quite yet?
I don't know. I actually don't have a good answer for that one either. It's interesting because I don't think I've learned that. I mean, I'm sure I've learned a lot of things, but I don't know that it's not obvious things that other people haven't learned.
What's the best life hack you've discovered for yourself?
Sleeping. I suffer from migraines a lot. And I know if I don't get a good 7.5 to 8 hours a night, I'm going to get a migraine. I'm going to get tired. I'm going to get depressed. Everything is going to be harder. So sleeping is definitely, in my mind, the number one life hack.
And Julien, based on your own life experiences and observations, what is the one habit or characteristic that you think best explains how people find success in their life?
Expectations. I think one of the big challenges, My wife is studying psychology, and we had a discussion the other day where she told me like most people that are depressed are actually depressed because they have a mismatch between the expectation of life and what they're actually doing. And sometimes we tend to have too high expectation. And I think especially in this attention-driven economy where we're being pulled to look at some shiny objects all the time, this creates this kind of stress on us because this gives us a higher expectation than what we should want. And, these expectations in the end are unhealthy. And reconciling this with the reality means that maybe having expectations that are more achievable makes us happier.
And then, Julien, the final 3 questions are complete the sentence type questions. The first one is, the thing that most excites me about Web3 is...
permissionless innovation.
And how about this one? If you're on Twitter, then you should be following...
me.
And lastly, I'm happiest when
I build things.
The GRTiQ 10.
After this, I show you how
Podcast.
Julien, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today and to introduce yourself to the Graph community and share your story. And there's a lot of nuggets of wisdom in your story and the things you shared today. If listeners want to follow you, stay in touch with the things you're working on, what's the best way to keep in touch?
I mean, after what I said about Twitter, I was going to say this is a good place. So twitter.com/Julien51, JULIEN51. I'd say my blog is actually another place where I would invite people to go. It's ouvreboite, OUVRE-BOITE.com. You can find the link on my Twitter. Generally, if you put my name, first name, last name in Google, you'll find, me wherever I am. Do say hello wherever you are. I mean, I try to be on every platform because I do think they all bring something different. I'm not the kind of people who say, oh, I don't want to go there because it sucks. It's like everything is different. If your jam is GitHub, pay me on GitHub. If your jam is Instagram, pay me on Instagram. I'm happy to have conversation with anyone everywhere.
This has been a production of the GRTiQ podcast. For more information, including detailed show notes, visit grtiq.com/podcast. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
Please consider contributing to this project and helping build the community by subscribing and leaving a review.
GRTiQ
Podcast. Roger that.